Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stefan Livera Podcast, brought to you by Swan.com, the best place to buy Bitcoin. Today we're going to be talking about the global fertility crisis with my guest. His handle is @morebirths, Daniel Hess. Daniel has been writing some interesting stuff on X, and I thought it'd be great to have a chat with him on the podcast. So first of all, welcome to the show, Daniel.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm very excited to talk about this topic, in my opinion, the most important under-discussed topic we've got in the world today.
Yeah, and certainly there are, let's say, some big, well-known people talking about it. People like Elon Musk are very vocal about the whole fertility crisis. And I guess let's hear it from you. How bad is this problem, right? Because a lot of people might just be thinking, you know, the world population now is 8.1 billion or around that. And yeah, maybe it's going to grow a bit and then start falling. What's the big deal?
Okay, here, I'm going to share something just with your viewers here.
Great.
So this is a map, as you can see. So in red are all the countries that are below replacement fertility. So just a little background, we regard replacement fertility as approximately 2.1 births per woman. It can be a little bit variable in whether it be a country like China with one that has a slight gender imbalance, or a place where there's high infant deaths. But in general, 2.1 is regarded as replacement fertility. So we see that almost every country in the world now is below replacement. Almost every country in the world, and that's just really shocking, because I mean, you have countries like India is below replacement. Most people assume that a country like India has very high birth rates. That is no longer true. Virtually every country in South America is now below replacement. So we have some incredibly it's an incredibly shocking fact that most people don't realize, is that almost the entire planet, with the exception of the continent of Africa and some Middle Eastern nations and some nations of Central Asia, are below replacement already. This is these numbers are falling fast all over the world. So I'm going to show you another thing in just a minute here. This is going to be a table of some of the fertility rates that we're seeing now. This is by the wonderful account Birth Gauge, so we can see what some of the fertility numbers look like. And so you can see in Europe, almost every European country is far below replacement. I know this table is a little bit dense, but if you look over here, East Asian countries are just have calamitously low fertility. For example, South Korea was at 0.72 births per woman in 2023, and it's trending even lower. China is around 1 birth per woman. So for the South Korean rate, that means that every generation will be only 1/3 the size of the generation that came before it. So that means, and this is a point that some people have made, for 100 people in a generation today, you may have something like 10 grandchildren and about 3 great-grandchildren. So that's just a cataclysmic collapse in some of these East Asian countries. Europe is, people may think that this is a white problem, but it's a global problem, and Europeans are not the worst case. The worst case in terms of ultra low fertility is actually East Asia, and also very interestingly, there's some South American countries that are showing extremely low rates, like below 1, like Chile, Chile is projected to be at 0.89 so just incredibly low numbers.
Yeah. Okay. So great. So look, let's spell that out for listeners. What is the actual implication then? What will it mean for those future generations if they are going to be a lot smaller?
Well, I think that it's going to be very difficult and very catastrophic economically for many countries. And you if you can imagine, here I'll just give you a few examples. In a place that is depopulating, the value of property can go essentially to zero. I mean, for an average property anyway. So for example, we see even places like Detroit today, Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, that has been depopulating. You can get houses for hundreds of dollars, or in rural Japan, which has been depopulating, there are houses that are basically given away for free to anyone who will take them. So that's just one example. But if there aren't enough people to buy all the houses, then property goes to essentially to zero in depopulating places, or at least for the average property. I mean, there might be some select properties that people compete for, but and just imagine that across all manner of assets. So here's another. There's another thing that I want to share it as well, which is here. What I'm going to show you now is the relationship between patenting and fertility, which is so actually this is a look at patents per million residents on the x-axis and fertility rate on the y-axis. So what do you see?
And just for the audio listeners, basically you've got, in the bottom right, you've got like the South Koreas and Japans of the world that have a lot of patents, but very low fertility rate. And then you've got a big spread there, but you've got sort of the United States has a relatively high patent rate, but also low fertility. And so, anything else you want to call out on the chart for the audio listeners?
Oh, sure. I mean, this is something we see is that, the most innovative countries, the countries that are at the center of the global economy, all have very low fertility. United States is not the worst of the worst, but, countries like Germany, China, Japan, South Korea especially, just very low fertility. And so what this means is the fertility crisis, the low birth rate crisis, hits the hardest kind of at the core of economies. And we talk about the future of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is going to save the economy, and it's going to be our wondrous, amazing future, right? What country is the number one? There's two countries that are the number one and number two producers of the chips used for AI. Do you know what those are?
Well, I'm guessing Taiwan and South Korea. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't. Taiwan may not be on this map, but it is well below one for its TFR. So these countries that we rely on, so strongly for the most essential, highest technologies that we have are the very countries that are facing demographic collapse most quickly.
Yeah, interesting. And so, look, I'm with you in the sense I would, I see myself as, in favor of natalism, but I can imagine we're seeing a lot of people who are, for various reasons, they're not as motivated by this, or maybe they see it like they can't afford to have children, or maybe they're just maybe it's more selfish. They're just like, I'm just going to live my life, and whatever happens after I'm gone, too bad. That seems to be a bit of a prevalent mindset. Well, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's the mindset. Certainly it used to be that people would, do the thing that they like to do, and babies would come naturally, and so you didn't have to have kind of a strong decision process necessarily to have children. You just did what your urges told you to do, and family would result. So we're in a completely new paradigm now, where you need a much stronger cultural aspect driving you to have children. Otherwise people will tend to have very low fertility.
Yeah. So that gets to, I guess, what we're trying to answer here is, what are some of the causes? Now, I've heard lots of different answers for this. Some of it is, okay, birth control, no-fault divorce, cultural issues. Is it, there's kind of all, is it economic problems that people can't afford to? Is it density? Is high density makes it harder to have children? Like, these are some of the ideas that I've heard. I'm curious, if you had to kind of point your finger at what are some of the key causes of this, what do you think they are?
Yeah, so wonderful question, and I think there's a lot of factors, and we shouldn't think of there's just one, but there are. I would say there are about 4 big ones. So I would say you've got marriage is a huge one. So the decline in marriage is driving a lot of that, or also later marriage, and then religiosity. The decline in religiosity is another big driver. Another driver is just the simple pronatal attitude or antenatal attitude. I mean, the idea that a lot of people have in their heads that because of the climate, it's bad to have children is impacting things greatly. And another point, as you mentioned, is density. So people have fewer children in cities. They have fewer children in high-rise apartments, things like this. So those are the 4 biggest factors. And then there's a lot of smaller factors, but if it's good to think that just keep in mind these largest factors, because those are the kind of the biggest engines, and I can share some charts demonstrating some of that if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So let's see that. Yeah.
Sure. So the first one I mentioned is marriage. So let's have a look at that. So here we see, these are a couple of charts that I made, and it's sorry if it's kind of small. I'll try to zoom in a little bit. But the first one is the
this
marriage
is American
rate.
states, isn't it? Yeah.
This is for U.S. states. So there's 50 of them. So it gives you a nice chart here, so you can see that the states where people are more likely to marry, for different cultural reasons, tend very strongly to have a higher birth rate. So in theory, you don't have to be married to have children, but in practice, that's what people do. And for all the talk that marriage is outdated, marriage doesn't matter anymore, actually, I would say marriage matters now more than ever, because people, don't have children unless they choose to, unless they want to, and if they don't choose it, then they're not going to, or if the conditions aren't exactly right, then people won't have children. And this is actually a big cause of the collapse in fertility in South America, because South America and also Europe, actually, they have much lower rates of marriage, and now that birth control is getting really, really good, it's almost perfect and long lasting, and people don't even use condoms anymore. It's that much. There's a whole range of other long-term birth control that are used that are much more, and so the result is that actually births outside of marriage are dropping precipitously, and so what you're left with is only births within marriage, actually. So marriage matters more than ever for fertility, and so since marriage has been dropping a lot, then quite naturally fertility has been dropping a lot. And I'll show you another thing. So it's not just marriage itself, but also marriage age. So here we can see the older you get, the older you are when you get married, the fewer children that you have. So that's another thing.
Yeah,
it's
pretty
not just
obvious, really.
It's not just marriage, but it's actually young marriage. So, people who are, if you're dating and checking people out, until you're 35, you're nearly out of time if you wait until, and also fertility itself, or fecundability is the actual word for how easy it is to get pregnant, and it's dramatically harder to get pregnant at even 35 than 25, and by the time you're 40, it's quite difficult for most people. So you have to. So people have long educations, and then they want to find themselves. They want to get established in their careers, do 100 things, and by the time they get around to having a family, for a lot of people, the time may have run out. And one thing to keep in mind is that it's not just that people don't want children. People want a lot more children than they're actually having. So So that's something to keep in mind. It's not just that nobody wants children anymore, but there's a lot of life factors that come into play.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions and points that kind of come up from there, but I think the one interesting one to me is just that culturally, people aren't pushed to marry and have children young nowadays, right? And now there seems to be this kind of culture of delay it until you have a stable career kind of thing. That seems to be the mindset.
That is a big thing. And, one cultural shift, I mentioned religion is another one. And here I can show another chart here. This one is by Lyman Stone. He's a wonderful demographer who provides so much research in this. But here you can see that people who never attend church, or religious service, I should say, of some kind. People who attend a religious service at least once a month have vastly more children than people who attend sometimes. Who have a lot more children than people who never attend. So this, may have to do with kind of the cultural norms. The religious institutions tend to encourage these cultural norms, but broader society, tends not to.
Yeah, I see. So in a way, religion might, might be a factor that, as you're saying, it is a factor that really contributes to higher.
Yeah, exactly. And I haven't found any high birth rate culture that doesn't have religion as part of its culture. We saw the chart of Africa having very high fertility. It's not just because Africa is poor. Africa is by far the most religious continent in the world. So that's people in Africa want to have big families, from due to religious beliefs.
Yeah. So I think the other point to me is it might also just be just cultural attitudes around having children, that maybe certain countries are becoming a little more hostile to actually having families and young children compared to other countries. And I sort of I noticed that.
And I have a great example of that as well, if I may show you something here. We're looking at the continent of Asia, and in particular, what I want to draw a comparison between is the nation of Mongolia and what's called Inner Mongolia, which is the part of China that's right next to Mongolia. And so the nation of Mongolia has 2.7 births per woman so far. So very healthy fertility in the nation of Mongolia. In Inner Mongolia, which is adjacent, but in China, fertility is only at 0.7 births per woman. So it's like at the South Korea level, in just adjacent, just across the border. And what is the difference? In Mongolia, that was part of the Russian or Soviet sphere, right? And the Soviet Union and its satellite countries, and Mongolia was kind of within that sphere, the influence of the Soviet Union. They were pronatalist. They wanted people to have children, and they actually gave women prizes if they had big families, like the Order of Maternal Glory is this medal that the people in these countries, including Mongolia, can earn if they have a large number of children. Meanwhile, in China, they had the one child policy, and and it's not just the force, but also the propaganda and the messages, telling people that you need to have fewer children. And now China has gotten rid of its one-child policy. Mongolia is no longer under the influence of Russia, but nevertheless, these cultural norms have been established. And so now, right across the border, you have 4 times as high fertility in Mongolia as in Inner Mongolia. So and there is a little bit of a cultural difference, but there's an ethnic difference there, but that cannot explain such a massive difference. That's, as you're saying, there's a cultural message. I wonder, even in the Western world, is it that there's kind of like more sort of Sex in the City feminism and kind of like don't settle down kind of thing, and that's kind of pushed the marriage age later.
as an example. And then maybe the boys have their own issues too. Maybe they're, playing video games and porn or something. And, there are just these cultural issues that have sort of stopped people on top of all the other aspects, right? Like the density.
I mean, there's a, but you mentioned two of them. At one major problem on the female side, one major problem on the male side. So that both men and women both have strong pronatal or antinatalist or anti-family kind of cultural elements that have kind of seeped into culture on the women's side. This sometimes an angry feminism, if you will, on the men's side. You can have opposite attitudes, but you also have problems with, as you say, video games, porn, a lot of distractions that, so there's a lot of women actually who have worked hard. They want to have a family, and they're looking, they don't need a millionaire. They don't need somebody who's 6'6" and covered in muscles. They just want a decent guy who is not in their mother's basement playing video games all day, right? And for young women, especially young professional women, those guys can be hard to find sometimes. So there's plenty of blame to go around, and you can't blame any one gender or any one idea. It's a whole set of circumstances.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate in a way, but I guess part of it is like, what are some of the ways to turn this around, right? As you were pointing out, and from what I've read, it sounds like there have been a lot of governments who have really tried to raise the fertility rates, but it seems like most of them have not been successful, or they've really overpaid in terms of the price. So as an example, I've heard Hungary has this policy where if a woman has 4 or more children, no more income tax for life for her. But I heard it's kind of turned it around a little bit, but not that much. And I've heard, in lots of other countries around the world, there are people trying these kinds of pronatal policies, but they're not having that much impact. I'm curious what you see there.
Yeah, it's tough, and one thing to keep in mind actually is that culture matters more than policy, and we need to keep this in mind. If for example, if young people are turning away from religion, or if they're embracing, a kind of pop culture that's not big on marriage, then trying to have some government benefits is going to be kind of weak sauce. They both matter, but I do want to use the example of Hungary. Hungary, I think, has brought its fertility rate from maybe about 1.3 to maybe 1.5 or 1.6. That's okay. I mean, that's good progress, because during that time when they got from 1.3 to 1.6, most of the world was seeing a big drop. So they're kind of having hard-won gains against a very strong current that's bringing fertility downward, all over the world. So I think they deserve some credit for their efforts. But a big problem and a big challenge is that American and Western culture are really kind of dominant in the world. And I think I can't imagine, I guess you're podcasting from, I think, Dubai. So you must experience and you must see that however much local areas try to have their own culture, it's just washed over by like the power of American culture and bands and
social
music.
Media is kind of influencing many parts of the world, right? And I can say now I'm an Australian, but I was born in Sri Lanka, so I have some awareness there. And Sri Lanka has a more, I would say, definitely by global standards, a more pro-family, pro-child culture. But even now, things are sort of are starting to get influenced by that global culture, as you said. And I'm hearing, and this is maybe global as well, there are women or young girls who are getting put on birth control pills, and then later in life that comes to bite them in the ass because now they're having trouble trying to get pregnant and that kind of thing. Yeah.
And, this is a difficult thing. I mean, you can't, on the one hand, you're right that these birth control, abortion, things like that, these are negatives, but you at the same time you can't just ban them. You'll get a backlash. One thing that's very interesting that happened in the United States is there was a big court ruling called the Dobbs decision, and after that some states were allowed to strictly limit abortion And what actually happened, most people don't realize this, but actually the number of abortions went up. It didn't go down, it went up because there was such a backlash that people were kind of more determined than ever to do what they wanted to do.
Right.
So you
maybe
can't
they go to another state and do it there or something.
Exactly. So you can't force these things, and you have to. You can't roll back freedom. People won't take that. So you kind of have to just build a stronger pronatal culture, have a stronger pronatal message. In Israel, abortion is legal, but Israel has a very high birth rate, and the reason is because they have a pronatal culture. People want to have children. The same in many Arab countries, in much of the where people have children, it's because there's a culture that's driving them in that direction.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the Cold Card Mark IV and the new Cold Card Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck, as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases. You can use Seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. And now, back to the show. Yeah, I see. And I think part of it is what is going to make you go and take on that cost? Because a lot of people if you're just looking at the dollars and the cents, it might not make sense, right? Like it might be more like, a common thing you might hear is people say, oh, look, this Asian government is giving certain child incentives, but the child incentive is nothing compared to the extra cost that you would pay to actually raise that child, right? And so that's where I guess you need a strong cultural, push to actually to encourage people to overcome, the cost of having children.
Well, there is one government policy that I think is rarely talked about in terms of sort of encouraging families, but you're from Australia, so that you may appreciate what I'm about to show you. Okay, so this is a fertility map and of Sydney.
Oh, cool. So
here we're looking, and what do you notice here on this map?
Yeah, as in the more close you are into the city, the lower your fertility, right?
Right. So what we're seeing, and just for people who can't see, we have a fertility of, in some places 2.1, 1.9 in these suburban areas around Sydney, but in the core of Sydney, your fertility is 1.0. So it matters. You double your fertility just by going from the urban core out to the suburbs. So there's an incredibly important lesson here for urban planners and for countries, because if you're building these high-rise apartment towers, you are sabotaging future fertility, because people just will not have a large family in a tiny little high-rise apartment. They will not. And in that vein, there's something. Here's another something I want to show you here. So here, what we're looking at now is this is Seoul. This is what Seoul looks like. This is downtown Seoul, and the fertility of Korea as a whole is like 0.7, but it's about 0.5 in downtown Seoul. And and a big part of that is the architecture. If people live in high-rise apartment towers, they just tend to have extremely low fertility, and this is true all over the world. So that's a major point of government policy that actually can make a difference. You really want to favor, and Australia and New Zealand and the United States have done this and tend to have relatively better fertility than countries that have built like the East Asian sort of the tigers.
I'm curious to get your view on this though, because a common point we're hearing now is that the cost of housing is so high, right? And so that kind of is a counterbalance as well, because there's so many people who are saying, I can't afford to even look after myself, let alone have a wife and kids. And part of the challenge then is because if everything is low density, well, it's going to be really hard to afford that, at least in the, in the city, in the nice areas, right? And so I'm curious what you think there. Like, yes, high density is bad from a fertility perspective, but it's also, I guess you could say it is cheaper from an accommodation perspective, right?
I hear that, but we have an interesting experiment, a natural experiment in actually Tokyo, Japan, because Tokyo has been building high-rise apartments in abundance for like the last 20 or 30 years. And so the rents in some places in downtown Tokyo are like just hundreds of dollars for a studio apartment. So it's incredibly affordable. But Tokyo still has the lowest fertility in all of Japan. So it seems that the cost isn't the biggest factor. And one thing, South Korea after the war, they had this idea that they wanted to, have affordable housing for everybody. So they just started building all these apartment towers, and they never stopped building these apartment towers. And now they're the lowest fertility country in the world. So we should build more housing, absolutely. And young people are having a very hard time affording housing, absolutely. But we need to keep in mind that it needs to be a kind of a family-friendly type. And so you don't have to be out on a farm like 50 miles from the nearest store or something. Although your fertility it will be higher in a rural area, but it's just to be in the suburbs and just have a single family home in a subdivision, makes an incredible difference. And I mentioned Australia. Australia is an example of a country that has done a wonderful job of building around cities in livable suburbs that. And the result is that Australia has healthier fertility than most of these.
Than other Western countries.
Yeah.
Maybe just less far ahead on the fertility collapse than some of the other countries, sadly.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious as well. Now, one thing that I see is welfare statism. I think welfare statism has arguably driven fertility rates down, because historically, if you had a child, it was maybe a little bit more like an insurance policy, whereas now with the welfare state, it's almost like the families who take on the cost to have children, those children are now paying taxes into the system to help fund the childless people who became old and never had children. So it's sort of, I think it kind of has this negative impact on the fertility rates in an unfortunate way. What do you think?
I think you're not wrong. I mean, I do think. And that may be a problem that we're seeing now. Everybody looked at like the Scandinavian countries like Sweden. They said, why can't you just be like Sweden? If we're just all like Sweden, then we'd have all our problems would be solved. And they have a big welfare state and stuff. And they have a lot of benefits around having children, which is, that's not a bad thing. But people, Sweden's fertility rate in the last, 5 or 7 years has absolutely plummeted. So they're now a very low birth rate country too. So that's kind of throwing that's messing up a lot of people's models in their minds. But you're right. Actually, freedom, having a free market is actually pro-natal. If people feel free, and there's another aspect to that is that with real freedom you have a lot of choices. If somebody wants to, go and become a Mormon. A Mormon is that's a religious group in the United States that is known for having bigger families. If somebody wants to go and become a Mormon, you can do that. If somebody wants to, use IVF and, have children in a high-tech, non-traditional way, you can do that. And So you have there's a lot of options, if you will, of things that you can do in a free society, so that when there's many pathways. Or another example is if women want to try to juggle work and having a family in the United States, you can do that. In some countries, like in East Asian countries, it's a lot more constricted. A woman is expected when she has children to stop working and stay at home raising the kids. And maybe you may say that's a good model for some people, but if you force it, or if the culture says you have to do this, then a huge share of women are just not going to want to participate at all. So in other words, that can be a good model for some people, but you have to at the same time balance that with a mindset of allowing all options, because if you allow more options, then more people will find a path that they like to have children. So freedom is a very good thing for that.
I'm also curious your thoughts. Now, I'm not sure if this is something you deeply researched, and not that I've researched it deeply, but some people were saying, I've seen people saying even low birth rates were almost like an indicator of collapse, even when it came to the Roman Empire. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. Like, is it just kind of a reflection of there's certain things that are going bad from a social and cultural perspective, and that's why so many countries around the world are going into a negative fertility rate?
No, okay. I have researched Rome extensively and had some viral threads about that on X, which readers who are interested can look into. And again, my handle is More Births on Twitter. So all sorts of stuff related to the birthright crisis and solutions. But so on Christmas Day of 2023, I had one particular thread that's a date that people can look for on the fall of Rome, actually. And so it really looks like that was specifically a fertility crisis, because there's documented evidence that the Romans had all kinds of birth control. They knew how to control births, and also the Roman leaders were passing laws to try to encourage people to have more children. So for centuries they knew that this was a problem, and then the cities kept shrinking because they were depopulating. So the evidence is very strong that the biggest reason that Rome collapsed was actually low birth rates. So very scary parallels with the numbers in the world that we're seeing today.
Yeah, and as I understand, I've read a couple books on this topic, not on the Rome point, but just more broadly. I forgot the exact name of the book, but I think in the book, the author was making this point that it really mattered for the future of those different countries, because the higher your birth rate, in those days, the higher your army, the bigger your army would be, and the kind of more economically successful. So it really mattered if they could motivate fertility and have a culture around it, and it would literally change the course of history if one country had a much higher birth rate than another.
Oh yeah. So that's you're exactly right. That's a major thing. But what we need to think of is like, even though we're not countries all at war with each other, I think the world has gotten more peaceful. But nevertheless, the power of economies, runs on populations and having large numbers of people. You have to have a lot of people able to work together to kind of build the modern world. It doesn't make sense for people to invent things if they don't have a market of, millions or billions of people to sell into. Or, another example that I mentioned before, we talked about, the big technology that everybody's excited about right now is AI. But AI sits on like this huge tower of millions and millions of people working really hard to, on everything, you can't just build AI, build these chips. You have to have, an unbelievable economic infrastructure that layers technology upon technology until you can get to this pinnacle at the very top of, which is these AI chips, right? And so if you have a smaller base, of people, you just can't climb as high. And that, Robin Hanson, who's a futurist, he has the Overcoming Bias blog, and he's an incredibly well-known thinker in the United States. But he has talked about how as population declines and begins to go backward, you're gonna stop innovating. You're gonna
Yeah, I agree with you. I think
your technology is going to stop, and so we assume that the world, we always have progress. But if you don't have more people, you're gonna lose progress itself.
Yeah, and I think to me it's clear, if anyone has actually really studied economics and understood concepts like division of labor, specialization of labor. If you imagine a town with only 100 people, they might have maybe a Chinese restaurant, but if you want more variety, you need a bigger town, because otherwise there's not enough people to kind of justify that. You don't get that sort of long tail effect. And as the population goes the wrong way, and not only that, it's also, I would say, it's the composition, right? Like historically, it used to be like a pyramid, right? There was a small amount of old people and a lot of young people, and now sadly, we're going the other way around. We're kind of inverting, and there won't be enough young people to work and produce things for all these old people who are needing more care and assistance. So that's probably the other economic problem, right?
Yeah, and I've got one more something related to that I can show, which is if we want to, we talked about South Korea a little bit. Here's a looking at population pyramids in South Korea, right? So here we see Korea today. Very, very, very few children, much fewer children than there are middle-aged people. So. But nevertheless, if you look at most of the population here today is between age 20 and 65. So
right,
even
age.
Though, and this is why the fertility crisis, the low birth rate crisis, is so deceptive and so easy to dismiss, because when you look at Korea, their economy is doing gangbusters. What's the problem? They're doing all sorts of amazing things. But that's because the fact that there's so few children doesn't hit the workforce yet. So if we project, forward into the future, here we have another population pyramid projected to 2060. There are more people over like the age of 65 than there are like under the age of 65. So you're getting to a world where Korea is going to be mainly old people, and the burdens on young people are just going to be, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and then it causes also this. There's going to be a real generational battle, I think, because right now, as you point out as well, that there are leaders around the world who are out there trying to encourage people to have children, but in some cases they themselves didn't have many children, or maybe they had one, right? Like I know the Singaporean, I'm not sure, prime minister or president, he was out there telling his people have more children, but he doesn't have any himself, right? And so, here's the point I'm trying to get to. There's going to be all these young people who are going to be forced to pay into the welfare state Ponzi, but when they're old, the welfare state Ponzi will not exist for them. And it's sort of like, how do you motivate people to actually care about that, right? And I think this is one area where maybe I have a slight difference with some of the other, let's say, people who are, talking about natalism and stuff like that, is I think people are, unless you kind of get like a really strong national pride sort of thing with people, a lot of people aren't going to care about that. They're going to be like, well, that's for someone else, right? Like, so maybe it comes back to more like a Brian Kaplan. What are the selfish reasons to have more kids, right? I'm curious what you think there.
Yeah. So I do think that that's part of it, but I do think that there's more power than people realize when you talk about it. I think the COVID crisis is a good example, I think, of kind of locking down, canceling all your events, and wearing a mask and doing social distancing. These are pretty unpleasant things, but with encouragement, people did these things, and you can have your opinion on whether that was the right thing or not. That's not that's not the point of that I'm making. But my point is that, people really wanted to do the right thing, and people did dramatic things to try to do what they considered to be the right thing. So I think that people would be surprised that you start talking about it and saying this is a problem. People, it's very important to have children. I think we shouldn't dismiss that. I think that could make a bigger difference than people acknowledge.
Back to the show in a moment. The lead sponsor of this show is Swan.com, and Swan has a mission to onboard millions of people into Bitcoin. I also work at Swan, helping on some educational content for the team. Now, the team have also put out a new version of the Swan Bitcoin application, which is available on your smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android. Now, this app has a really fast onboarding experience. It's now just a few minutes to go from zero to Bitcoin. So if you are standing there with your family or friends and you might have been having trouble trying to get them onboarded, well, try this now. Recommend Swan Bitcoin. And you can do this while you're standing next to them. They can click through, and most of them will be able to set up and do this in just a few minutes. Also, the team at Swan have rolled out a new promotion. There are 0 fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys. So this is a great way to go from zero to Bitcoin, and in a guided and managed way. So reminder, go to your App Store or Play Store and search Swan Bitcoin to get onboarded with Bitcoin today. This show also brought to you by Mempool.space, the leading Bitcoin and blockchain visualizer. I use it all the time when I'm checking transaction fees and trying to understand what is the state of Bitcoin's mempool. You can search transactions, historical as well as unconfirmed ones, and also see a great way to visualize things across the Lightning Network, Liquid, mining, and so much more. Also, for those of you with an enterprise, they offer a Mempool.space enterprise program. So for those of you as part of that enterprise program, you might want to get increased API limits, and you might want to have increased access to the team in terms of feature requests. You might want to have special branding in terms of how your custom instance of Mempool.space looks. So to sign up for that, go to Mempool.space/enterprise. And now, back to the show. Right, and I mean, to some extent, it's a cultural thing that if you're let's say you're in a friend group and everyone there is married and has children, obviously you're a lot more likely to do that too because you want to fit in. And so there's certainly an aspect to it there. And I think part of it is, I think culture is going the wrong way right now. And there's going to be a bit of work required to sort of turn it back and get it going the right way. And so one area I've seen you speak about on this is the 3-child norm. So this is this idea that instead of kind of the nuclear family with the mom, dad, and 2 kids, you're talking about this idea of a 3-child norm. So can you explain what you're getting at here?
Okay, so yeah, I can show you something else related to that. I really love data, and I think data is actually very important because you have to show people what's going on here. So here what we're looking at is this is the number of children people had, in the United States over time, or the percentage of women that had 4, 3, 2, 1 or 0 children. And we see throughout for people born in the 1800s, 70%, 65% of women had 4 or more children. So that was just the norm back then. And now, it's only like maybe 6% or something have more than 4 or more children. The most common number, of course, is 2. So people have this number in their mind that the right number of children to have, if you're a proper right-thinking middle-class person, you should have 2 children. That people have that's I don't know if it's Leave It to Beaver. I don't know have you ever heard of that? That's a show from
it's a famous show.
Yeah. So that was there was the perfect little family, the mom and the dad and the 2 kids. So that kind of created a kind of a model in people's minds, but actually that number 2 is not a good number because what happens in the world today is that roughly a third of young people now in most developed countries are not going to have children. So just to make the math work, then the average among people who have children should be 3. If you think about it, if one third of the people are having 0 children, then the remaining 2/3 have to have 3 children on average just to be at replacement, right? So it would really help to just have a higher, norm for in people's minds. If the people have heard the replacement is 2, but you look at most of Europe, the total fertility rate in most of Europe is like around maybe 1.4, 1.5, something like that, and that's what you get when the
norm is 2. Yeah.
When 2/3 of the people end up having 2 children, and the rest have 0. People who are unpartnered or just not at the right place have 0 children. And so one thing to keep in mind is that you look at this chart that we're looking at here. People there was always a share of people that had 0 children. That wasn't even in the 1800s. There was 15% had 0 children or something like that. But the norm of everybody else was this 4 or more children. So if you have a norm of larger families, then it's okay if some people just don't have children. You can't force people to have children. We do not want like the world of Ceausescu, where you're trying to force people to have children who don't want them. But people need to realize that that we do have a crisis of low birth rates, and people should think about having larger families. Just if things are going well, if you're happily married, if you have a good enough income to do it, then have a bigger family. It's fine. I speak as a father of 6. Actually, I have 6 children, and
right.
It's an absolutely wonderful thing. One of the greatest things that I think about having children is that you get to be a kid a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time. You get to experience that. When it snows around here, which is right now in Washington, it is approximately 101 degrees outside. But in the wintertime, when we get our snow, I can go out with the kids, with the younger ones, and go sledding. If you try to do that as a single guy with no kids, and you're a very strange person, and people are going to be very suspicious of that. But you can do all the fun things with your kids and kind of get a second go at childhood, and it's so that's one of the underrated joys, actually.
Yeah, interesting. And as you say, with this kind of the historical norm of how many people had children, I guess a lot of people, they take their cues from television and movies, and maybe they're thinking about that, or maybe they are thinking about the baby boomer generation. But actually, based on the chart you were showing, it's actually historically people had more kids, and then it was dropping, and then there was kind of this boom after World War II. That's the baby boomers, and then it's been falling, at least in our time.
Right. And actually, the baby boom is a good thing to talk about, because there's some real lessons there for factors that impact fertility, and we can learn a lot for the future, because nations and leaders of all kinds are going to be desperately focused on how to fix this problem. But there are 2 major factors that kind of cause the baby boom. The first one is that people married at very high rates. Like over 90% of people were marrying at that time, and they tended to marry young. So in the United States, for example, the average age that a woman got married, I think, was like 20 or 21 years old. So if you get married young, you just have a whole lot more time, to have a family. That was the first factor. And the second factor in the United States, and maybe some other countries, was you had this suburban building boom. So you were building a lot of houses, but you weren't just building houses. You were building the right kind of houses. You were building, and they didn't have to be huge. I mean, these were, they talk about, they were kind of derided as these cookie cutter, houses that are cheaply built and whatever. But that's a little underrated, because, for a working class person or a middle class person, just having a house with a yard is an amazing, wonderful thing. And we shouldn't, it's pretty arrogant and elitist to kind of knock on the suburbs and call suburban sprawl and say, call them McMansions or whatever. But, that large house for a big family is just a wonderful thing. And, it's, who can afford a single family home inside of a city? I mean, in most world cities, that's probably millions of dollars.
It's just not feasible, yeah, unless you're very rich, yeah. And I think the other point I'm curious to get your thoughts on is the expectations seem to have risen a lot. Whereas, when I was younger, or kind of stories I hear, is that people used to share rooms, right? Like kids would share rooms. Whereas nowadays, it seems almost like the expectation now is that you only have 1 or 2 children and you put massive investment into them, or at least, I'm not endorsing, but I'm just saying that seems to be the current mindset, is that you should only have a few children and just put in a lot of resources into them and take them around to whatever, piano class and soccer and whatever. Is it just that the expectation has changed and we need to sort of recalibrate those expectations so that people feel comfortable to actually have children and not necessarily have to have like a 7-bedroom mansion?
No, I'm so glad you bring that up, and you're such a. It's so great to talk to you because you've done so much research and you know a lot already. So this is another important point. And my good friend Tim Carney has written a wonderful book. Let me see if it's on my shelf right now. It may be elsewhere. But he's talking. His book is titled Family Unfriendly, and one of the first things he talks about is a trend that's huge in America, which is travel teams. So.
Right. Like this is when the kids travel for sport and then the parents have to spend all this money to kind of fly with them or whatever.
It's completely nuts and out of control in the United States. And I had to make a decision with my wife that we are not going to do travel teams. One of my daughters is a swimmer. She's excellent. And but they some of her fellow swimmers here in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is, Maryland is nuts about swimming, by the way. We have, Michael Phelps and Katie Ledecky are both from Maryland. We're just nuts about swimming. But, these kids have these swim meets like in Orlando, Florida. That's 1,000 miles away. And then imagine, flying 1,000 miles for your kids to have like a swim meet. You know what I mean? And this is common now. People are just traveling all over the country, sometimes to follow their kids around in sports. And this is, it's such a burden on the parents, and it's so exhausting. It's financially expensive. It's exhausting on their time, on their energy level. They're not, and this is, you don't need to do all this. As you say, put a few bunk beds in rooms and you can do it much. You don't have to do everything perfectly. One of the points that Brian Kaplan makes is your kids are probably going to turn out roughly the same,
Right. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as the saying goes, right?
Exactly. So you don't need to, the fact that one parent drove 1,000 miles, every month to send their kids to different soccer tournaments while the other parent just gave their kid a ball and let them play in the neighborhood. The kids are probably going to turn out pretty similar. They're probably going to kind of turn out like their parents, right? So that's so we burden ourselves too much, and that's a big problem. And actually, the nation of Korea is a great example of that. They have these cram schools called Hakwon that and I don't know how many hours a day Korean young people study, but it's an unbelievable amount. And, it has, education has its benefits, but, there's a point where the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? If you're trying so hard, you're trying to do everything perfect, and that nation is going downhill because people are trying too hard in a way. That's a problem.
Yeah, and so I guess it comes to sort of turning it around, as you said, like as one theme here is kind of the cultural aspect. How do we turn this around as a society or as a culture? I think, from a Bitcoin perspective, this is something I've seen in a lot of Bitcoin circles where a lot of Bitcoin people are thinking of it from a low time preference perspective. They're thinking multi-generational, and as they start hodling Bitcoin, they start thinking more about, do I want to leave a legacy? Okay, yeah, I want kids. I want to do these things. So I think that's something I've noticed, at least in amongst my Bitcoiner friends. I would say the Bitcoiner friends I have do have higher fertility rates, or at least higher intended, and they're kind of getting started on it. And I'm working on it, and so
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think some of these things will change, but it's there are cultural things that have to be solved there. But it's kind of to the Asian country paradox as well. It is kind of a paradox to me that some of these countries, they tried so hard to make sure they're all wealthy. They work hard and study hard and make sure that their kids are high skilled. And here I'm thinking South Korea, Singapore, Japan, these countries that are very economically successful. They became rich, but they failed at motivating fertility, and it's an interesting paradox.
There's one more thing that I would like to talk. There was an event that happened yesterday, which was the nomination that we have a Bitcoin holder.
Right,
hodler.
JD Vance, yeah.
Yeah. So here we go. There he is. Can let's see. There we go.
Oh, no, I can't see. Okay, yeah, coming up now. Yeah.
There it is. So that's his very lovely family. He I think his youngest came I think about 2.5 years ago or something. But but this is exciting because he is one of the first politicians in the English-speaking world that has been talking about the problem directly. So, actually saying birth rates are too low. We have a crisis.
Yeah.
And he's been willing to say that.
He mentioned he wanted to give an extra vote to parents for every child they have, something like this.
Oh, I'll take it. Yeah. But
it sounds like he's
Elon
a little
Musk
bit more
has said
into
something like that as well,
yeah.
I think. But you need to. It's important to just talk about it. People. I really think people want to do the right thing. So people need to know that there's a low birth rate crisis. It's very strange. Canada, for example, they have incredibly low fertility now. I think 1.2 or so, 1.25, incredibly low. And the government realizes this is a problem. So they are, they're trying to roll out free childcare for every parent. That's or near, I don't know, free, but close to it. Very inexpensive childcare for every parent. And that, there's a lot to be said for a policy like that. But Justin Trudeau in Canada has not mentioned one time that we have a fertility crisis. He could, you can spend billions and billions of dollars, but you would have a greater impact just by saying, hey guys, if things are going well, if you can afford it, it would be great if you could have more children because we have a low birth rate crisis. Just say that. People want to, and that's why I'm excited about JD Vance, because he kind of, breaks the taboo. But I don't know why it's a taboo. But he's willing to talk openly about it, and that makes a big difference, especially for English-speaking countries, because sort of the English-speaking world is kind of sets global culture.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the cultural setting, the culture, because it could be that other countries around the world sort of look to, let's say, America and sort of the Western world for a cultural lead, and then they follow that. And so that's probably an interesting point. I would say from a libertarian perspective, from a free market perspective, I think there are many ways in which the state is unfortunately hurting the birth rate, right? Whether that's fiat currency, central banking, whether that's regulation. I think we are massively overregulated in most of the world, and that's raising the cost of childcare. It's raising the cost of things like, having a nanny or daycare and all these kinds of things. And I think that is also what's really making it difficult for the, let's say, millennial and Gen Z generation to sort of get on with it and start having a bunch of kids.
You made a very specific point, and there's one particular aspect of deregulation that makes a huge difference, which I think you mentioned, deregulating childcare. I mean, where I live, it can be $2,000 a month or something for one child.
completely out of the reach for most,
and what, I've been lucky that my wife has been able to, and I've been working from home. So, but between the two of us, we've been able, I should mention this because this is an important element as well, is, when the kids were small, my parents, who live nearby, were able to provide, a lot of childcare, especially for my wife when we had 4 little ones at one point. They were all very closely spaced, and it was hard. And my wife, my mom would come over, pretty frequently when my wife was exhausted, and my wife would just sleep or go away or do something, and my mom would have the kids for 3-4 hours, and that was, it made all the difference in the world, because my wife could, rest or do what she wanted to do and come back refreshed. And so family cooperation is very important. But there's one more kind of thing that I do want to mention related to kind of families working together, which I think is a good thing. But there's one thing that's not so good, and here I'm going to share a map here. This is, people living at home. So this is one more fertility. It's a very big fertility factor that I hadn't mentioned before. But we see there are certain countries in Europe, for example, Spain, Italy, Poland is another one. But especially these Mediterranean countries, young people. This is a map of people aged 25 to 34 who still live with their parents. Okay, and we see that countries where a very high share of people in their young adulthood live with their parents, those countries have very low birth rates. So that's another element of culture, that, the importance of young people getting out into the world and not living at home. It's, parents helping their children is a wonderful thing. If a parent wants to, help foot a down payment for their child, or help with childcare, things like this, that's a wonderful thing. That helps a lot. But if a young person is still living in their parents' basement, or still living at home in their bedroom that they lived in all along, that's a big problem. So families should help each other, but it's also very important for young people to get out of their parents' house and establish their own lives, pretty early.
Yeah, for me that comes down to, I think a lot of fiat currency and government control over the money has caused a lot of these issues around cost of living, and unfortunately it's kind of generationally unfair, because there are people who manage to get in at a much smaller multiple of their salary.
You're absolutely right, and this I feel very bad about. Even, I'm at the very tail end of Gen X, so I was born in 1978, so I'm very tail end of Gen X. But I became a homeowner in 2008, and I'm a beneficiary. Our house has a very low mortgage interest rate. It's we've seen a lot of appreciation on a. It would be very, very much harder to get in today. And as you say, fiat currency, has a lot to do with that, because
if you were 25 trying to buy the house you're in today, would you be able to do it? Maybe not.
I don't know. So there is something to be said. I didn't need my parents to help me with a down payment, but I do think that there is something to be said for that, because just houses are so expensive these days, and the baby boomer generation is sitting on a lot of equity from that, as you say, fiat currency. It's just been inflation just driving up the prices of these houses. And, so I think there's a lot to be said for parents maybe helping their kids a little bit with a down payment or something. But if we were in a different kind of money system, I don't think houses would be so difficult to afford.
That's the key problem, right? Is that the housing has been financialized. People treat it like their life savings asset, instead of understanding housing more like a consumable thing, right? It's seen as like, property only goes up. It's kind of it's wrong-headed, and unfortunately, it's a sad result of the fiat currency system that we're in. And so I think that's, from a Bitcoin perspective, I think that's the key point that I think people need to sort of understand, is that we need to fix the money by changing to a money that
we definitely
yeah.
this tendency to run debts and have higher inflation does seem to have a very huge cost on young people. So I think, but it's talking. One thing I would want to give young people some encouragement to just, when it comes to family, most people when they're in their 20s and 30s, they tend to be kind of poor. And those same people, when they're in their 40s and 50s, they tend to be much richer, actually. But you have to kind of take the leap and have a family when you're in your 20s and 30s, because that's when that's when people are fertile. You can't you can't wait until your 40s and 50s when you're finally more well off to have a family. That's too late. So you kind of have to take a leap of faith, when you're young, and trust that if you're on a solid trajectory, you'll get there. So
I think for me it's more just like, and look, like I said, I agree about overall encouraging people to have children, but I think the leap that you're asking, a Gen Z or a millennial person to take nowadays is not the same as the leap that a Gen X or a boomer was being asked to take, right? In terms of how much of their salary, what are the sort of
I hear that, but I want to
conditions.
push back a little bit, which is this. I mean, there's a relative wealth, and young people are relatively, have less wealth than people older than them. However, overall, people in the past were poorer. They, people, nobody goes hungry these days. People have, as wealth has gone up, as people have grown wealthier and had more resources, they've had fewer children, not more. And this is kind of a point that Elon Musk has made, that the root of the low birth rate crisis is not a lack of money, because people were poor in the past and had a lot of children. The biggest factor is culture. So the biggest thing, including religious belief, including just believing in the future and believing in having children and having that, and also having a mindset of wanting to get married when you're young, not spending 20, 30 years. I have a cousin who was kind of dating around for a while, and then finally he found somebody to marry at the age of 50. And right. So no kids there. He was just kind of playing the field for 30 years. Like, come on,
Yeah.
So you people should be thinking actually about getting married even in their 20s even.
Yeah.
It seems strange to say that.
I agree with you on the cultural aspect of it, that society should encourage people to marry younger, ideally. But, there's kind of points back and forth. Yeah, I agree with you that people used to live more brutal lives, right? Like life was harsher 40 years ago, and people, just sort of dealt with it. Maybe people were tougher, and maybe that's also another indictment of society today, that people are just kind of weaker in a mental sense.
I would say this, people, if you want to challenge, one big problem is people are bored with life, everything. If you want excitement, go have kids. If you want to mess things up and kind of make things more interesting. And I think people are happier, honestly, when they're carrying a heavier load. Like, this seems like it's like paradoxical.
Paradoxical, yeah.
But we have it in some sense easier. There's more luxuries. There's more entertainments than ever before. But depression is higher than it's ever been before. So I think people want to have a heavy load. People want to be working. And if you want your life to, if you want to have more challenge, go have kids, and it'll be much more interesting and all these things. There's one more point that I wanted to mention as well, one factor, which is kind of work. And, work from home is a wonderful thing for fertility. People tend to have more children, sometimes that's not an option, but where it's possible, countries and governments and companies should do their best to encourage that, because, you mentioned the childcare difficulty, almost a crisis of childcare being so difficult to obtain and not very affordable. Well, if parents can work from home and have, a little bit different schedules, then they can cover most of the time. And so that's a big positive as well.
Yeah, work from home definitely was accelerated in the last few years. So look, let's leave it there. I will put the links in the show notes, but listeners, you can follow Daniel at the handle is at More Births on X. Links will be in the show notes. Daniel, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And yes, please check out More Births on X, and you can search through my timeline to learn everything you want about this topic. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation.